Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amber, and together with me, I have Gladys, Ning, Ananya, and Sarah. We'll be sharing more about our findings relating to data science perspectives on global nutrition and happiness. In a world grappling with escalating health crises, the link between nutrition, physical well-being, and happiness has never been more critical. The facts are stark. There's been an increasing trend in obesity rates, posing a serious threat to global health and driving chronic diseases like diabetes. In response, global bodies are calling for urgent action, a shift towards diets rich in fiber, and a reduction in excessive fats and sugar. Simultaneously, the UN's World Happiness Report reminds us that well-being is a central pillar of sustainable development. While happiness is complex, countries with healthier food systems and access to nutritious diets consistently report better physical and mental well-being. As nations strive to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, generating data-driven insights into how dietary choices and food composition intersect with our overall happiness is essential for securing a healthier and happier future. Let's dive straight into answering this question. Do countries with higher average protein or fat intake during winter months tend to report higher happiness? We often hear that healthy diet leads to a happy life, but our latest analysis dives into a surprising nuance: the winter link between what we eat and how satisfied we feel with life. We examine how a nation's average intake of protein and fat during the coldest months, December through February in the north, June through August in the south, correlates with its reported happiness score. Our correlation matrix revealed a very strong positive relationship between happiness and the intake of animal protein and fat. It means that countries that consume more energy-dense and traditional diets during the winter months tend to report statistically higher levels of life satisfaction. Conversely, we found an extremely strong negative correlation between happiness and the intake of vegetable protein. This suggests that a higher reliance on plant-based protein during the winter is actually associated with lower reported happiness scores. It suggests that during the cold, dark days of winter, the preference for energy-dense, perhaps comforting foods may play a unique role in mood and psychological well-being. Now, this correlation is not causation. We are not saying to eat more fat to be happy, but these findings underscore the profound complex interplay between the seasonal dietary tradition, energy balance, and mental health. It challenges us to look beyond simple caloric restriction and explore how dietary density and dietary patterns, especially during the winter periods, impact a nation's collective feeling of well-being.
For question 17, we examine whether long-term fat intake trends from 1961 to 2020 correlate with happiness. We merged the daily intake and happiness datasets in SQL and calculated each country's average fat intake across the full period. Scatter plots and cluster bar charts were then used to visualize the relationship. From the scatter plot, we observe an overall positive correlation where countries with happiness scores above 7 typically show much higher average fat intake, around 1200 to 1500 kcal, while those with scores near 3 fall between 200 to 800 kcal. However, the cluster bar chart shows that this pattern is not perfectly consistent, where, for example, Brazil has a high happiness score but only around 800 kcal fat intake, similar to countries in the 5 to 6 score range. Overall, higher happiness generally aligns with the higher fat intake, but notable exceptions such as the relationship is not strictly linear.
When exploring the question of whether countries with a lower nutrient variation actually are happier, the data actually suggests that this is not true. There is only a very slight relationship that actually is incredibly insignificant. Instead, what it suggests is that basically rigidity of food trends, which may be due to food insecurity in lower income countries, or be due to the rigidity in cuisine and culture that is, local, actually shows no link to happiness reported by populations and hence cannot be accounted for as a factor in variation in happiness.
Our analysis explores three linked questions. First, is there a relationship between processed food intake and fast food menus? Second, how do these consumption patterns affect happiness? And finally, what are the health implications? To answer these, we combine population-level dietary intake data with the nutritional composition of fast food items from McDonald's, Burger King, and Starbucks. Globally, diets are shifting towards energy-dense, highly processed foods. Using the daily intake dataset, we observe a steady increase in calories from fat and animal protein across countries. On the other hand, the fast food datasets give us item-level nutrient data, letting us compare how national diets align with commercial food offerings. Our goal was simple: to see whether everyday processed food trends mirror what's being sold in fast food menus. The results show a clear convergence. The average Burger King item has around 31 grams of fat and 993 milligrams of sodium. McDonald's around 10 grams of fat and Starbucks roughly 9 grams, mainly from dairy and pastries. Across all three chains, sodium and fat levels are consistently high, often exceeding a healthy meal's recommended limit in just one serving. This mirrors what we see in population intake. Diets increasingly built around high fat, high sodium, and low fiber foods. So, fast food doesn't just reflect current diets, it reinforces them, normalizing these nutrient dense, low quality meals worldwide. When we link this to happiness data, we find an interesting balance. Countries with moderate fat and protein intake tend to score higher on happiness and life expectancy. But beyond that point, excess processed fat and sugar show diminishing returns. Basically, fast food may bring short term comfort, convenience, affordability, and pleasure. But in the long term, it contributes to physical and emotional fatigue. Happiness grows with sufficiency and variety, but drops when diets become overly processed. Health data confirms the cost of these overconsumption. High sodium intake raises the risk of hypertension. Saturated fat and cholesterol contribute to obesity, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. Our health flag analysis classified many fast food items as high risk meals. So, what starts as an occasional indulgence becomes a chronic health burden when it forms the base of a diet. And that pattern is now visible across multiple regions. To wrap up, processed food and fast food share the same DNA: high fat, high sodium, and high energy density. Balanced diets can enhance happiness, but excess leads to both physical and mental decline. Overconsumption gives short term pleasure, but long term harm. In short, fast food is not just a meal choice, it's a symptom of global dietary industrialization. It satisfies the moment but undermines long term well being.
I'll be answering the questions: does fast food consumption increase health risk, and could the risk be mitigated? I sourced two datasets from the links and merged them with daily intake dataset in MySQL. From these, I extracted variables such as global fat intake, global animal protein, global vegetal protein, McDonald's revenue, and global obesity prevalence. After combining all relevant fields into a single dataset, I exported the final table from MySQL into R for further analysis. First, this figure shows the global rise in obesity rates from 1990 to 2022. Obesity, defined as a BMI of 30 and above, has steadily increased for both men and women. And women consistently have higher obesity rates, rising from around 9% in 1990 to nearly 19% in 2022, while men increased from about 3 to 14%. Next, we look at nutrient intake. Across fat, animal protein, and plant-based protein, high intake is strongly associated with higher obesity rates, showing how as consumption increases, so does obesity rates. This figure further illustrates this pattern, showing that fat consumption worldwide has generally been increasing since the 1990s. While there was negative growth in the early 1990s, the long-term trend is still positive, indicating that global diets are progressively becoming higher in fat over time. And this figure examines the relationship between fast food consumption and obesity, using McDonald's revenue as a proxy for fast food consumption. I did this by fitting a linear model, and the positive trend shows that higher revenue, meaning greater fast food intake, are linked to higher obesity rates globally. To understand how dietary changes could help, I simulated a scenario where fat intake was reduced by 10%. From the graph, you can see that both men and women would have lower predicted obesity rates under this reduced fat scenario, and on average, a 10% reduction in global fat intake corresponds to about 3.45% decrease in obesity prevalence. In summary, the analysis shows a clear link between rising dietary fat, fast food consumption, and global obesity rates. All these trends raise health concerns such as increased risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. The model also shows that even modest improvements in diets could meaningfully reduce obesity levels worldwide. And small sustained changes in dietary habit can make a significant difference for public health.
When exploring the blue sky question of whether there were nutritional shifts in the US and what these could be accounted for, the two data sets that I chose to incorporate were the Google Trends interest for the word keto, which is a low-fat, high-carb diet that gained popularity somewhere in between the 2010s, and the word protein, a word that is still gaining popularity to date. The other data set that I chose to incorporate was the inflation of consumer prices in percentage year on year from 1960s to 2022 of the US from the World Bank. Now, these two data sets were taken in light of the background that US should and does follow the global shift towards energy-dense foods. That is the gradual increase in protein and increase in carbs with a gradual decrease in fat intake. Another point of view that is seen as in context is that carbohydrate and protein-rich foods by research have been shown to be more expensive. Now, all of this combines to two very nice understandings and clear understandings. A, it is that the trend of protein intake, which is very slight and is the increase of it, actually shows no link to the popularity of it, despite the popularity of protein increasing as a word, and despite the popularity of a high protein diet and a low carb diet like keto spiking in the late 2010s, there was actually no associated change. In fact, what shows a much stronger correlation is actually the change in inflation. A spike in inflation actually shows a reversal of the global trend of decrease in fat to an increase in fat, which can be attributed to more people switching to more cheaper food alternatives like fast food, as is elaborated by my teammates, and a sharp drop in the amount of carbohydrates that have been intaken, which are also associated with more expensive foods. To me, this condenses down to a very clear insight, which is that the actual defining factor is economic accessibility and availability of food as a driver of change in food habits and a change in what people consume, despite, social behavior and social trends in the understanding and in the nutrition field itself.
Moving on to question 22, it raises a question on what month should governments increase public awareness of unhealthy food spikes and which healthy options should be introduced. Our analysis of total energy intake shows a clear and consistent pattern that government campaigns must address. Contrary to common belief, the biggest period for overconsumption isn't the December holidays, it's the late winter and early spring. We see a significant rise starting in February at 4.18%, sharply peaking in March at 4.69%, and remaining high through April at 4.34%, above the annual mean. This means that public awareness campaigns must strategically pivot to focus on these periods to address factors unique to this time, be it lingering post-holiday stress, weather affecting physical activity, or seasonal events. To make a real impact, the government can focus on the highly visible fast food sector. Nutrition experts recommend main meals stay within the 500 to 700 calorie range, making less than the 600 calories range a safe and sensible public target. This also tackles a major problem, which is consumers often underestimating fast food calories by hundreds. By promoting a clear, simple sub-600 calorie goal, we counteract that pervasive underestimation and guide better choices. Our data highlights readily available and healthy fast food options that meet this goal from the dataset, like Starbucks fruit blend and McDonald's coffee. These are small portion-controlled indulgence that satisfies craving without the significant caloric harm. For a more substantial option, the government can promote items like Starbucks Perfect Oatmeal and McDonald's Pizza. These provide better nutritional value and while staying well below the 600 calorie threshold. Finally, the government can consider encouraging the introduction of healthier and customizable options. Think build your own green and veggie bowls with lean protein. We'll also push for more nutrient-dense sides like fruit cups, which serve as essential and healthy substitutions for high-calorie sides like fries. By combining data-driven timing with clear and accessible fast food options, we can empower the public to make smarter choices and successfully combat the annual energy intake spike.
I'll now be discussing our final blue sky question 23, which revolves around the impact of reduction of sugar-based diets on happiness, health, and economic outcomes, as well as evaluating the effectiveness of explicit and implicit policies. So before implementing any form of explicit policies, it will definitely be beneficial to evaluate the reduction of sugar-based diets on happiness, health, and economic outcomes to balance potential benefits against unintended consequences and to make evidence-based decisions. So to evaluate the impact of sugar-based diets, a data set consisting of daily individual intake of sugar-sweetened beverages, also known as SSB, estimates were sourced from the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, also known as IHME. SSB was chosen to represent sugar-based diets and it is a major contributor to excess calorie intake among young adults. As this data set consisted from 1990 to 2021, it was filtered for data in 2015 and merged with a 2015 happiness data set, which consists of each country's GDP, life expectancy, and happiness score. So the average SSB intake for each country was calculated by taking the average SSB intake across 15 age groups in the dataset, ranging age 25 to 95, and happiness scores, GDP, and life expectancy were then plotted against the average SSB intake for all countries. So a scatter plot was first plotted to observe the relationship between average SSB intake and the three metrics. But at first glance, all three scatter plots and regression line show a very clear positive correlation. And what is most striking to me is that increased SSB intake can improve health outcomes. Thus, the interaction between these metrics were considered. There can be a possibility where countries with higher GDP can have better healthcare and living conditions, which leads to higher increased life expectancy. And the same countries can also consume more SSBs due to greater purchasing power, resulting in SSB intake and life expectancy to coincidentally have a positive relationship. But that does not necessarily mean that increasing sugar intake increases one's life expectancy. So to account for this, GDP was then controlled, and GDP-controlled life expectancy was then plotted against GDP-controlled SSB intake in a residual plot. So from the residual plot, where each residual point represents a country, we can observe that most countries cluster on the top left corner, which can also strongly suggest that countries who consume less SSBs, but not necessarily due to less purchasing power, do have better outcomes. In addition, the regression line plotted in the residual plot also shows a very weak upwards trend, with SSBs not being strongly positively correlated to health outcomes compared to the previous scatter plot. So at first thought, it may seem that the reduction of sugar-based diets can possibly impact countries negatively, where high sugar intake countries appear healthier, wealthier, and happier. However, we need to account for the complex interactions between these metrics. When we remove the influence of GDP, we are able to clearly see the direct relationship between SSB intake and health outcome. Reducing sugar-based diets in a country, therefore, has clear health benefits, and these findings support the prompt adoption of policies that lower sugar consumption to improve overall population health. So with many countries already recognizing excess sugar intake as a concern, various policies has already been implemented. This includes explicit policies like sugar taxes or implicit policies like public education. So in order to assess the effectiveness of explicit and implicit policies, a global sugar consumption trends dataset was obtained from Kaggle, where it simulates different outcomes for a set of policy and environmental outcomes for different countries from 1960 to 2023. And this dataset also mimics real-world sources such as the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization. So with this dataset, we will specifically be looking into countries in 2018 with different policy scenarios while setting the most typical environmental condition for each country. The year 2018 was chosen as for our scenario analysis, as it will be more reliable, and it also has a reasonable number of data points across all countries as well. So with this data, box plots were then plotted to visualize the trend in daily average sugar intake and total sugar consumption in different policy scenarios. So on an individual level, comparing average daily sugar intake across policy types shows that countries implementing both education and tax policies have the lowest median sugar intake, followed by those implementing only tax policies. And interestingly, countries with only education policies display a higher median sugar intake than those with no policies at all. While taxation has consistently been shown to reduce sugary food consumption and lower beverage sales globally, education alone may raise awareness, but does not always necessarily translate to immediate behavioral change. And on a country level, the box plot shows that education-only and combined policies have a lower median sugar consumption than tax-only policies, with tax policies also exhibiting greater variability. Although taxes can reduce sugar intake, their effectiveness depends on contextual factors such as the affordability of healthier alternatives. And if these remain significantly more expensive, consumers may still opt for tax sugary options. Likewise, while education policies show lower median consumption, the presence of outliers suggests substantial variation across countries, highlighting that policy effectiveness overall is shaped by socio-economic and market conditions. So while it's theoretically ideal to have both explicit and implicit policies in place, If countries were to prioritize immediate and effective reduction of sugar consumption, countries can first prioritize implementing explicit policies such as sugar taxes, with already many global studies proving the effectiveness of such policies. And we have come to the end of our presentation. Thank you.